For most of the 20th century, the origins of civilization were told through a story that seemed elegantly simple, almost too simple to question. According to this narrative, humanity spent more than 200,000 years living in small, scattered groups, wandering through an unforgiving world with only the most basic tools. Then, almost as if history had been waiting for a cue, the Sumerians suddenly appeared in Mesopotamia around 3500 BCE. They brought writing, temples, administration, cities, irrigation, and the first complex social systems. In this traditional timeline, everything before them was little more than a silent prelude, an evolutionary waiting room before the real beginning. But before we jump back in, drop a comment letting us know what time you're tuning in and where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our episodes are reaching. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It really helps us keep bringing exciting topics here on the Primal Roots channel. But the discoveries of the last 3 decades shattered this comforting myth. As new archaeological methods emerged, calibrated radiocarbon dating, isotopic analysis, 3D scanning, microstratigraphy, digital reconstruction, and high-precision mapping, the prehistoric world began to speak. And what it revealed was something that not even the most imaginative scholars had predicted. Long before the Sumerians, long before writing, long before the first official cities, human groups were already building monumental structures, organizing collective labor, shaping landscapes and expressing symbolic meaning on a scale that should not have been possible for hunter-gatherers. The transition between the final Paleolithic and the earliest Neolithic, once thought to be a foggy, underdeveloped era, now appears as one of the most dynamic and experimental phases in human history. Around 12,000–10,000 BCE, the world was undergoing dramatic environmental change. Glaciers were retreating from areas that had been frozen for millennia. Seasonal patterns shifted. Megafauna species declined or vanished. Regions once barren became fertile grasslands. Rivers carved new paths. The planet itself was reorganizing, and humans reorganized with it. For decades, scholars believed that the people of this period were merely reacting to environmental pressures, adapting out of necessity. But evidence tells another story. Instead of passive adaptation, early Holocene communities were experimenting with architecture, with ritual, with cooperation, with identity, and with shared memory. They were not waiting for agriculture. They were inventing new ways to be human. One of the most surprising insights to emerge from modern research is that these early groups were far from isolated. For a long time, archaeologists pictured them as fragmented bands wandering through empty landscapes. Yet new data shows that these landscapes were anything but empty. Seasonal gathering sites, shared hunting grounds, ritual spaces, and exchange networks connected people across vast distances. Ideas traveled long before trade routes existed. Stone carving techniques migrated between groups. Symbolic motifs appeared in multiple regions at the same time, suggesting communication and cultural continuity. This new archaeological vision forces us to rethink everything we thought we knew. Complexity did not suddenly appear in Mesopotamia. It grew slowly, unevenly, experimentally, across Anatolia, the Levant, the Zagros foothills, the Jordan Valley, and beyond. Before the first cities, there were architectural experiments. Before temples, there were ritual enclosures. Before writing, there were symbolic systems that organized memory and meaning. The earliest chapters of civilization were not written in clay, but carved in limestone, painted on plaster, shaped into beads, and arranged into communal spaces whose functions we are only beginning to understand. Yet for decades, this deep prehistory remained invisible, not because it lacked evidence, but because archaeology lacked the tools to see it. Early excavations relied on limited dating techniques that made anything older than 6,000 to 7,000 years difficult to place accurately in time. Linear evolutionary models insisted that agriculture must precede monumentality, that hierarchy must precede urban density, and that writing must precede administration. Anything that contradicted this sequence was dismissed as an anomaly, but as scientific methods evolved, the anomalies multiplied, until they were no longer anomalies at all. Instead, They formed a pattern. Monumentality existed before agriculture. Symbolic complexity existed before sedentary life. Cooperative labor existed before hierarchy. And ritual existed before cities. The old model collapsed under the weight of evidence. The world before the Sumerians transformed from a vague, empty period into a rich and intricate landscape of innovation. Groups who did not plant fields or build permanent villages were gathering in large numbers, carving multi-ton stones, creating ceremonial architecture, and expressing symbolic identities with stunning sophistication. Their achievements were preserved not in writing but in stone, often buried intentionally, as if they understood that memory itself was a structure worth protecting. This raises an unsettling but powerful question. If people without agriculture or permanent settlements could create monumental architecture, what else were they capable of? The answer, as emerging research shows, is far more than we ever imagined. Archaeologists now understand that the earliest human communities were not drifting through prehistory in a state of cognitive simplicity. They were conceptual thinkers, planners, ritual performers, craftspeople, negotiators, and storytellers. They were shaping symbolic worlds long before the first kings, priests, or administrators appeared. Cooperation was not a byproduct of civilization. It was its foundation, tested and refined over thousands of years before the first city walls rose in Mesopotamia. The more layers archaeologists remove, the more this early world reveals a startling continuity. Boncuklu Tarla, Göbekli Tepe, Çatalhöyük, Jericho, and the Ubaid settlements, though separated by time and distance, share principles that challenge everything once taken for granted. They show us that complex social behavior is not a sudden invention, but a deep inheritance. The end of the Ice Age did not simply warm the planet. It exposed an entire chapter of human ingenuity, one that had been buried beneath sediment, time, and outdated assumptions. It was a world where ritual shaped settlement, where cooperation shaped architecture, and where shared symbolic meaning laid the groundwork for everything that would follow. Civilization did not begin in a moment. It began in a long, intricate experimental process, a process that unfolded thousands of years before the first Sumerian scribe pressed a reed into clay. This is the forgotten world, the invisible foundation, the chapter before history, now finally brought into the light. For generations, archaeologists believed they understood the sequence of human development. First came small villages, then agriculture, then temples, then writing, then cities. Ritual spaces were supposed to emerge only after a society had created surplus food and hierarchical leadership. Monumental architecture, according to the old timeline, required everything that hunter-gatherers did not have: permanent settlements, organized labor, administrative roles, and a structured economy. So when Göbekli Tepe came into view, it did not simply challenge that model, it overturned it completely. Perched on a barren ridge overlooking the plains of southeastern Anatolia, Göbekli Tepe appears at first glance like a forgotten crown of stone. But as its circular enclosures began to emerge from the soil, one detail dominated all others: its age. At roughly 9,500 BCE, it predates Stonehenge by 7 millennia, and the Egyptian pyramids by nearly 8. More importantly, it stands thousands of years before the first wheat fields, permanent houses, or domesticated animals appeared in the region. According to every traditional expectation, it should not exist. The enclosures consist of towering T-shaped pillars arranged in perfect geometric circles. Some stand nearly 6 meters tall, many weigh more than 10 tons. They were quarried from nearby limestone outcrops and dragged uphill without the wheel, without beasts of burden, and without metal tools. Yet the precision of their construction is undeniable. They are aligned, they are planned, they are intentional. Closer inspections reveal carved reliefs of animals: foxes, scorpions, boars, cranes, snakes, vultures, leopards, each rendered with striking confidence and anatomical accuracy. Some animals seem to move across the stone as if captured mid-stride. Others appear alongside abstract symbols that may represent concepts no longer accessible to us. Whatever these carvings meant, they were not ornamental, They were symbolic expressions of a shared worldview, etched into stone with a patience and mastery that defies simplistic assumptions about early humans. Yet the most revealing evidence is not in the carvings, but in the absence of everything else. Göbekli Tepe contains no homes, no grinding stones for daily food processing, no domestic hearths, no midden layers rich with household waste. Nothing suggests year-round habitation. This was not a village. It was a ritual gathering place built by mobile groups who returned seasonally, investing collective labor into a structure of symbolic importance. This single fact reverses the long-standing assumption that ritual emerges only after agriculture. If hunter-gatherers were building monuments of this scale, then ritual was not a luxury of settled life. It was a driving force. The need for shared identity, for ceremonial gathering, may have created the social pressures that eventually led to agriculture, not the other way around. This insight reshapes our understanding of why humans first domesticated plants. Growing food may not have been a gradual, accidental process. It may have been a necessity for supporting large episodic gatherings. Feeding dozens or hundreds of people at once requires planning, storage, and cultivation. Monument-building events likely demanded predictable food sources, encouraging experiments with wild cereals that eventually became farming. In this sense, ritual may have given birth to agriculture, not emerged from it. Another mystery deepens Göbekli Tepe's significance: its burial. Over centuries, the site was intentionally filled in with stones, bones, and debris, layer by layer, as if its builders sought to protect or retire it. The fill material was not deposited by erosion or abandonment. It was deliberate, purposeful, and repeated. One enclosure after another was sealed and hidden beneath mounds of earth. This act suggests something profound. Memory mattered. Whoever buried Göbekli Tepe was not erasing the past. They were preserving it. Perhaps the rituals changed, or symbolic priorities shifted, prompting them to close one enclosure and construct another. Perhaps burying the site marked the end of an era, a turning point for a worldview that was evolving into something new. Whatever the reason, the burial allowed Göbekli Tepe to survive for more than 10,000 years, frozen in time beneath the hill that concealed it. But Göbekli Tepe's significance extends far beyond its stones. It also exposes flaws in the assumptions that once shaped archaeology. Early scholars often approached ancient societies through narrow lenses, insisting that complexity required hierarchy, surplus food, and rigid social structures. Göbekli Tepe reveals that cooperation does not require central authority. Shared symbolic meaning can unify without kings or priestly castes. Teams of hunter-gatherers likely gathered seasonally in the region, pooling labor to erect pillars that no single group could have completed on its own. This suggests not only communication between groups, but deeply rooted systems of trust and coordination. People who lived separately for most of the year came together to build something greater than themselves, something that transcended daily survival and expressed a collective identity. In this sense, Göbekli Tepe serves as the earliest visible proof that humans were capable of large-scale collaboration long before the formal mechanisms of civilization appeared. Such collaboration may have formed the psychological foundations of later cities, temples, and states. Ritual was the glue, architecture was the language, stone was the memory. The surrounding landscape reinforces this view. Several smaller sites, Karahan Tepe, Sefer Tepe, Hamzan Tepe, and others, form what researchers now call the Taş Tepeler complex, a constellation of early monumental centers that share similar traits. Some predate Göbekli Tepe, others evolved alongside or after it. Their existence indicates that the region was not an isolated anomaly but part of a broader cultural horizon that understood architecture as a symbolic tool long before agriculture took hold. When seen in this wider context, Göbekli Tepe becomes not merely an isolated marvel, but the expression of a much deeper process: the emergence of symbolic architecture as a core element of human identity. These early monuments functioned as places where different groups could meet, share stories, solidify alliances, perform rituals, and reaffirm a collective sense of belonging. They were centers of meaning before they were centers of population. As archaeology continues to uncover new layers, one truth becomes increasingly clear. The people of Göbekli Tepe were not primitive. They were not wandering aimlessly. They were creative, organized, intentional, and visionary. They understood stone as memory, design as communication, and ritual as the foundation upon which future societies would rise. In many ways, Göbekli Tepe is the doorway into a forgotten chapter of humanity, a chapter in which the first expressions of civilization appear not in cities or writing, but in the shared imagination of people who carved their beliefs into stone long before the dawn of recorded history. When archaeologists first uncovered the tightly clustered architecture of Çatalhöyük, they struggled to understand what they were seeing. It did not resemble the early cities they expected. There were no avenues, no plazas, no temples rising above the others. Instead, they found a vast, honeycomb-like mass of homes pressed together without a single street between them. People entered through holes in the roofs, climbing down wooden ladders into rooms whose walls had been plastered and replastered for centuries. Inside these spaces, layers of white plaster, murals of powerful animals, geometric designs, and reliefs of leopards revealed a symbolic world as dense as its architecture. Çatalhöyük dates to around 7500 BCE, younger than Göbekli Tepe, but still far older than the first Sumerian cities. And yet, despite its density, it offers no evidence of hierarchy, no elite houses, no palatial structures, no temples, no storage facilities that might suggest centralized authority. Everything we associate with city formation, governance, class divisions, administrative systems, is conspicuously absent. Instead, what emerges is a model of urban life built on shared traditions, mutual maintenance, and symbolic continuity rather than domination. Each home in Çatalhöyük functioned as a microcosm of the community, a place for living, crafting, ritual, burial, and memory. Beneath the floors, bodies were interred in carefully prepared graves, sometimes accompanied by beads, pigments, or carved objects. These burials linked the living directly to their ancestors. Every step across the plaster floors was a step over the generations who shaped the household. This merging of domestic and sacred space created a unique form of social cohesion, one rooted not in hierarchy, but in shared identity. The city's unusual layout raises questions. Why were there no streets? One possibility is defense. Without ground-level entrances, intruders would find it difficult to move through the settlement. Another explanation lies in sanitation. Walking on rooftops and entering from above kept the interior cleaner and minimized contact with waste, which accumulated in designated areas outside the building clusters. But beyond practicalities, the layout may reflect an ideological system. Çatalhöyük's architecture suggests a worldview in which community was a tapestry of households, each similar in size and status, woven together through shared rituals and spatial intimacy. While Çatalhöyük offers a vision of urban life without hierarchy, Jericho, located in the Jordan Valley, presents another early experiment with complexity. At nearly 9000 BCE, Jericho is one of the oldest continuously occupied settlements in human history. Its massive stone walls and monumental tower challenge any notion that early communities were fragile or unorganized. The tower, rising more than 8 meters high, contains an internal staircase carved with precision, indicating not only technical skill but coordinated labor and planning. Jericho's walls have long been debated. Were they defensive, ritualistic, or protective against flooding from the nearby spring? Whatever their original purpose, their existence reveals a society capable of mobilizing collective effort on a scale once thought impossible for early Neolithic communities. Yet, despite these structures, Jericho also lacks evidence of centralized leadership. No palaces or elite residences emerge from its archaeological layers. Instead, it reflects a community that invested in large-scale projects without requiring rigid authority. Together, Çatalhöyük and Jericho break the mold of what early settlements were supposed to be. They do not fit the evolutionary ladder proposed by early archaeology. Instead, They represent diverse experiments in community building during a time of profound change. Some groups built densely packed domestic landscapes without streets. Others constructed monumental walls and towers. Still others focused on ritual enclosures rather than permanent habitats. Diversity, not linear progression, defined the Neolithic world. As the early Holocene continued, another cultural horizon emerged, the Ubaid culture of southern Mesopotamia. Dating from around 5900 to 4000 BCE, the Ubaid period bridges the gap between early experiments like Çatalhöyük and the later urbanism of the Sumerians. Unlike the tightly packed homes of Anatolia or the fortified walls of Jericho, Ubaid settlements display a new kind of order. Houses are rectangular, spacious, and built with standardized floor plans. Early temple structures appear, modest yet clearly distinct in their elevated platforms and controlled entries. These patterns suggest emerging norms. Architectural traditions shared across communities. Ceramic styles become increasingly uniform. Irrigation canals expand into more complex networks. Population clusters grow around fertile lowlands previously considered unstable. The Ubaid world hints at the first threads of administrative thinking, but still without evidence of kings or rigid social classes. Complexity was rising, but slowly, and from the bottom up, rather than through imposed authority. When Çatalhöyük, Jericho, and the Ubaid horizon are viewed as parts of a larger process, a clearer pattern emerges. Human societies were not moving in a straight line from simple to complex. Instead, they were exploring different ways of living, testing possibilities and shaping social systems long before the emergence of states. Hierarchy was not inevitable. It was just one of many experiments that eventually succeeded. These early settlements reveal that large populations can function without rigid leadership. Ritual can unify without priesthoods. Architecture can express identity without palaces. And symbolic systems can flourish without writing. Each community found its own way to navigate the transition from mobility to sedentism, from seasonal gatherings to permanent settlement, from shared rituals to shared spaces. Yet one detail unites them all: collective labor. Whether building walls, plastering houses, carving reliefs, or maintaining irrigation canals, these early communities operated on cooperation. The roots of civilization lie not in domination, but in collaboration. People did not gather around kings. They gathered around shared meaning. As archaeological layers reveal more of these early societies, it becomes clear that the first cities were not defined by what later cities would become. They were defined by experiment. Çatalhöyük explored equality, space, and symbolic domestic life. Jericho explored fortification, endurance, and environmental adaptation. Ubaid settlements explored standardization, early administration, and the integration of ritual into community planning. These were not lesser versions of later civilizations. They were the prototypes, the first blueprints of collective life. And they remind us that urban living did not emerge from a single spark, but from countless attempts scattered across millennia, each adding something new to the human story. What these ancient places give us is not a linear path, but a map of possibilities. A world where ritual, architecture, cooperation, and identity formed the earliest foundations of civilization. A world where people gathered, built, remembered, and imagined long before the first scribes carved symbols into clay. A world where the future of humanity was shaped not by rulers, but by communities. A world where cities were born not from power, but from connection. As the early Neolithic world expanded, communities across the Near East began weaving webs of interaction that stretched farther than anything seen before. They were no longer isolated experiments scattered across fertile valleys or wind-swept plateaus. Instead, they were becoming participants in a slow but powerful convergence, a merging of ideas, symbols, techniques, and beliefs that would eventually define the trajectory of civilization. This was not a sudden leap, nor was it guided by a single culture. It was a collective awakening, shaped by thousands of people whose names will never be known, but whose decisions formed the foundations of the world we inhabit. By 6500 BCE, the landscapes of Southwest Asia had transformed. Communities that once lived in small clusters were now spreading across larger territories, linked by exchange routes that moved obsidian, pigments, beads, shells, and symbolic motifs across hundreds of kilometers. These networks were not purely economic. They were social conduits through which stories, rituals, and identities traveled. The same abstract symbols carved into stone at Göbekli Tepe reappeared in clay tokens used for counting at early Ubaid sites. The plastering traditions of Çatalhöyük found echoes in the decorative walls of northern Mesopotamian settlements. Even burial customs, with their careful arrangement of bodies and painted skulls, formed patterns across regions that had never been politically united. Something deeper than trade was emerging, a shared cultural vocabulary. Communities were beginning to recognize one another not just as neighbors, but as part of a larger human landscape, connected by ritual, aesthetics, and memory. These patterns laid the cognitive groundwork for the later emergence of cities, states, and writing. Civilization did not appear fully formed. It first existed as a network of shared ideas, long before it became a network of shared laws. One of the clearest signs of this growing cohesion appears in the way early settlements were planned. In the millennia following Çatalhöyük, architecture gradually shifted from organic sprawl to deliberate order. Buildings became more uniform. Layouts began to reflect social logic rather than mere convenience. Central structures, once ambiguous, grew more defined. In some sites, raised platforms began to dominate the settlement's silhouette. In others, communal buildings appeared, where gatherings, rituals, and decision-making likely took place. This architectural evolution does not imply sudden hierarchy. Instead, it reflects a changing sense of community, a recognition that shared spaces could embody shared identity. Humans were learning to build not just shelters, but social frameworks. As these frameworks matured, a new layer of complexity began to unfold: the management of resources. Communities were now staying in place long enough to exhaust nearby soils, overgraze herds, or strain water supplies. These pressures demanded new solutions. Irrigation ditches appeared. Fields were rotated. Storage pits and later granaries became central to settlement planning. Such innovations required coordination, not dominance, but consensus. They transformed daily life into a communal enterprise that blended practicality with ritual purpose. For early societies, managing resources was never purely economic. Food was tied to ceremony. Water was tied to myth. Tools were tied to identity. Every practical decision carried symbolic weight. This interplay between survival and meaning is what distinguishes the early Neolithic world from later civilizations, which often separated administration from spirituality. In the beginning, they were inseparable. Across these landscapes, another quiet transformation was occurring: the domestication of social memory. Long before writing, people found ways to store and transmit knowledge. Clay tokens were used to represent quantities. Marks on stone tracked seasons or ritual cycles. Repeated symbols acted as mnemonic anchors, ensuring that stories, laws, and myths could be preserved across generations. These tools may seem simple, but they laid the foundation for the cognitive revolution that writing would later complete. In this era, memory was architecture. It was encoded in the layout of settlements, in the placement of ritual objects, in the shared experience of plastering walls year after year. People lived inside structures that reminded them who they were and where they came from. Identity was not written in books. It was built in stone, clay, plaster, and ritual. The rise of long-distance exchange accelerated this process. Obsidian from central Anatolia reached the Levant. Shells from the Red Sea appeared in inland settlements. Bitumen from Mesopotamia traveled north into the Zagros foothills. These items were not mere luxuries. They were symbols of connection, physical proof that communities were part of something larger than themselves. This interconnected world gave birth to a new kind of human experience, the sense of belonging to a broader cultural horizon. People were no longer defined solely by their local group. They saw themselves within a wider mosaic that stretched across mountains, valleys, rivers, and plains. This shared horizon became the fertile soil from which future civilizations would grow. Yet despite these transformations, early societies remained remarkably egalitarian. Leadership was situational, not institutional. Influence flowed through experience and reputation, not inheritance. Ritual specialists may have existed, but they did not wield political power. Authority was woven into the fabric of daily cooperation rather than imposed through force. Communities functioned not because individuals controlled others, but because everyone understood their place in a system built on mutual reliance. It is easy to forget how radical this is. Before the rise of kings and empires, humanity spent thousands of years developing sophisticated social structures without formal hierarchy. This is perhaps the most important lesson of the early Neolithic world. Complexity does not require domination. By the time the Ubaid culture began spreading across southern Mesopotamia, these foundations were already in place. The characteristic long houses, temple platforms, and carefully organized villages of the Ubaid period did not appear out of nowhere. They were the culmination of countless earlier experiments in community building. What made the Ubaid culture different was scale. Settlements grew larger. Architecture became more standardized. Ritual and administration began intertwining in more explicit ways. Organized labor became more common, and slowly the first seeds of hierarchy started to germinate. Even then, the transition was far from abrupt. There was no sudden emergence of kings, no immediate appearance of writing, no instant administrative system. Instead, authority evolved gradually from cooperation. Ritual specialists, once merely guides in symbolic matters, took on broader roles in managing resources and coordinating labor. Communal decision-making slowly centralized into emerging institutions. Social memory expanded from oral tradition and symbolic architecture into early administrative tools. By 4000 BCE, still centuries before the first Sumerian cities, the world had already changed. The template for civilization was set. All that remained was for population, trade, and symbolic complexity to amplify it into something recognizable as urban life. What began with hunter-gatherers carving ritual stones on a lonely ridge at Göbekli Tepe had become a network of interconnected communities shaping landscapes, managing resources, and building identities across vast regions. Humanity had crossed a threshold. It was no longer adapting to the world. It was shaping it. The dawn of civilization was not a single sunrise. It was a long, unfolding glow that brightened over millennia, built on cooperation, imagination, and shared belief. The first great cities of Mesopotamia would not emerge in isolation. They would rise from these foundations, from the dreams, rituals, experiments, and collaborations of people who lived thousands of years before history began. And in their memory, carved into stone, plastered into walls, and buried beneath ancient floors, we find the earliest whispers of the world we now call our own. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. It really supports the channel and helps us bring you more great stories.